Emily Chang in San Francisco, and this is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up in the next hour, on the cusp, Joe Biden on the verge of clinching enough Electoral College votes to officially win the U.S. presidency. This as signs of stimulus life from Congress emerge, and right on time as New York City nears the threshold for another shutdown. Plus, U.S. at risk evidence. Russians just pulled off the most sophisticated and perhaps largest hack of U.S. government agencies ever. What they may have taken and how. And cooling off, the red-hot Airbnb and DoorDash IPO stock prices of last week falling off as analysts assess their value. We're going to talk to longtime Silicon Valley tech investor Ron Conway of SV Angel, also an early backer of both companies. But first, U.S. stocks fell for a fourth day as investors wait for a stimulus plan to become a reality. That, mixed with the likelihood of a second New York City shutdown, painted a bleak picture of the short term. Our Abigail Doolittle has more. Abigail, give us a roundup.
Well, Emily, it's interesting because earlier in the day, there was a very bullish tone, an optimistic tone, maybe set last week by those IPOs you were talking about. But by the end of the day, big moves lower for both of those stocks, following a bit of a pullback on Friday as well after, as you know, Airbnb up more than 100%. But today, the S&P 500 on the open up about 0.9% on vaccine optimism, the fact that it's being distributed. And then at the end of the day, the fact that there is no stimulus passed weighing. But probably the bigger news, Governor Cuomo saying that New York City could be shut down within a month. So I think that brings back the reality of the virus in the near term to investors. And we see the S&P 500 down about 0.4%. The Dow Transports, though, really underperforming, down 2.3%. This is of concern because back in January, when the virus first emerged in China, the Dow Transports was the index to lead because it's so sensitive to the economy. So keep an eye on that one. On the other hand, you have this year's defense, safety of big tech, which is still hard for me to get my mind around. But the NASDAQ 100, the New York FANG Index, both of those indexes climbing higher as investors are seeking that safety. As for the virus itself and the vaccine makers earlier today higher, including Pfizer, on that distribution. But you see a bit of sell the news action here. So that's something of concern. And AstraZeneca down 7.8%. That has probably more to do with their buy of Alexion Pharmaceuticals for $39.1 billion. Alexion Pharmaceuticals is a rare disease specialty company. Their one drug in particular is a rare blood disorder. So AstraZeneca making a bid for this biotech company in a bid to expand their portfolio. That stock absolutely soaring on the day. Over the last 3 days, Alexion Pharmaceuticals up more than 35%, the best 3 days since 2002. On the day, though, the biggest story, Emily, is the bearish reversal. Again, that S&P 500 at one point up 0.9%, on the close down about 0.3%. Concerns around the virus, and of course, the fact that there is still no stimulus out of Washington, Emily.
All right, our Abigail Doolittle, and of course we will be watching for additional stimulus by the day. Thank you so much for that update. Meantime, Electoral College members in all 6 battleground states where President Trump most fiercely contested the results cast their ballots for Joe Biden today, effectively cutting off the president's path to overturning the election. For the latest, I want to bring in Bloomberg's White House reporter Josh Wingrove. And Josh, we're just waiting for this to formally pass that 270 vote threshold. But what does this mean? Does this, or will this, put an end to President Trump's efforts to challenge these results?
It probably not, given that everything else hasn't seemed to, but it might put an end to Republican senators and other lawmakers sort of going along with it. I think that's the most likely thing here. Biden is going to take this as a clear turning point, a watershed. We expect to hear from him in a little while. They've released some advanced remarks. He's basically going to say, well, this does it. The people have spoken. Let's move on. But President Trump hasn't given indication, including today, that he's interested in doing that. He continues to say that this was all rigged. They've produced no evidence of a widespread conspiracy that they're alleging. They've just sort of cherry-picked anecdotal things here and there. Their legal cases have almost overwhelmingly been rejected. I think listen, he's fundraising off of this. He wants to cast himself as, the victim of a hoax. He sees political incentive to do that. So, no, I don't think we can expect Donald Trump to go quietly, but we might see a little less quiet, shall we say, from Republican senators.
Do you believe the transition of power will We know President-elect Biden has been naming members of his cabinet, but as we get closer to Inauguration Day, is the Trump administration, how can and will, do you expect the Trump administration make this transition more difficult?
Well, I suppose it depends on whether they schedule any sort of counter event that might sap sort of the appearance of the transition. But by and large, we think or hear that sort of at the career staffer level that Biden is getting engagement. That'll help in particular with things like the vaccine. Huge news today, right? We don't want the baton to be dropped in terms of the vaccine rollout. A lot of people running that aren't so much political appointees; they're career staff. So I think that certainly, at least Biden has not expressed a lot of concern that there'll be some complications there. But it is what it is. We almost are dizzied by talking about it. The president just simply has given no indication that he will accept the results as we know them. Has offered no evidence that he should. The rest of us shouldn't accept the results as we know them, and it's just it leaves the Republican Party in a bit of a quagmire. They can't really get offside of Donald Trump. There's one congressman who's retiring today who spoke out a little bit, but beyond that, most have not.
Meantime, vaccinations have started. Of course, it'll be a while before everybody gets them. There's a huge logistical challenge ahead. The Pfizer vaccine needs to be stored at super low temperatures. How is the rollout going so far, and what are the biggest challenges ahead going to be?
Yeah, I mean, I'm Canadian, and even I think it's cold what they have to store that vaccine at. Look, this is a year where we're desperate for good news. Today is good news, and we expect to even see more good news with the Moderna vaccine later this month. Anthony Fauci gave an interview with our Bloomberg Law colleagues talking about another vaccine, a third one, Johnson & Johnson's, which is a little different. It's a different kind of vaccine, and if it's good news, then it's really kind of really good news across the board, because it'll mean that not just one kind of vaccine will be able to help. Now, that said, we're still months away. This is the sort of rain on the parade part, and it's an occupational hazard, and I'm sorry. But, we're still 6 months probably or a little more away from widespread availability. That means masks and social distancing are going to be a part of the equation for a while yet. As you say, there are those logistical challenges, and there's simply just surging demand. They're going to struggle to make enough of this stuff to meet the demand quickly. So it's good news. It's good news, but we're not out of the woods yet. I believe that one of the Trump officials today called it the sort of beginning of the end. We're sort of entering the final stage, but that doesn't mean that we're crossing the finish line of this pandemic yet, unfortunately.
Well, Josh, I am from Hawaii, so you can imagine how cold I think this temperature sounds. Let's hope they do work out these logistical challenges as we go by the day. Josh Wingrove, our resident Canadian, thank you so much, Josh, for that update. All right, news that Pinterest has paid $20 million to settle a legal case with its former chief operating officer, Françoise Brocker, who alleged she was fired for speaking out about gender discrimination at the company. She said she was paid less than her male peers and was left out of Pinterest's IPO process, even though she was the #2 executive. Pinterest and Brocker released a joint statement saying, Françoise welcomes the meaningful steps Pinterest has taken to improve its workplace environment and is encouraged that Pinterest is committed to building a culture that allows all employees to feel included and supported. All right. Coming up, the U.S. government doubles down on its scrutiny of big tech as the FTC takes another hard stance on the biggest social media and video platforms. We'll have all the details next. This is Bloomberg. The U.S. Federal Trade Commission has issued orders to Amazon, YouTube, and Facebook and 6 other social media companies to hand over information about how they collect and use information from users. The country's top privacy regulator saying the firm's use of consumer data is, quote, shrouded in secrecy. The sweeping demand comes after the agency sued Facebook for alleged violations of antitrust laws just last week. To discuss, we are joined by Mark Mahaney, Managing Director at RBC Capital Markets. So, Mark, obviously the pressure from the U.S. government on big tech in general has been ratcheting up. How much does this latest salvo from the U.S. government change the equation?
I like your expression, Emily. It just ratchets up the pressure on these companies, and it's become clearly a bipartisan issue. You notice that in the congressional hearings in the middle of the summer. It was what I called a opening of a congressional bipartisan can of whoop-ass on big tech. It's Republicans and Democrats. So yeah, these companies have clearly become very large, very powerful, and there are legitimate questions as to whether they've become too large, too powerful, both in terms of their acquisitions and in their internal practices. Privacy issues are a little bit separate, but the scrutiny is super high, and at least it very much limits the ability of these companies to do any large-scale acquisitions.
This statement from the FTC today: the decisions that prominent online platforms make regarding consumer and customer data remain shrouded in secrecy. Critical questions about business models, algorithms, data collection, and use have gone unanswered. Policymakers and the public are in the dark about what social media and video streaming services do to capture and sell users' data and attention. It is alarming that we still know so little about companies that know so much about us. As somebody who has covered these companies for so many years, I'm sure this is probably the height of scrutiny that you have seen on these companies from the U.S. government. How big a risk should investors take this into their calculations when they're thinking about whether to invest in these companies at already high valuations?
Well, let's see. Regulatory issues aren't necessarily new. Google is paid, I think, about $10 billion now in fines. Facebook is paid. Those are European fines. Facebook is paid about $5 to $6 billion in the U.S. to the FTC for violating a consent decree or acknowledging that it may have violated a consent decree. So investors are used to fines. Investors are used to this kind of scrutiny. So I don't think it changes the investment thesis on this name. You'd have to really have a required breakup or a required change in business practices. But Emily, you've tracked this industry for a long time. A lot of these models, it's kind of a trade-off for consumers. If you want a free service, you have to give up some of your privacy. You have to give information. And by the way, in many ways, I think it actually makes the service a lot better. You get targeted ads rather than junk mail. And I think most consumers prefer the targeted ads. How, in fact, they get the information to target the ads, that's kind of the secret sauce for a lot of these businesses, and they'd rather not tell and regulators or anybody that for competitive reasons, but they may be forced to now because of regulators. And so anyway, that's the new issue. But I don't think it changes the investment thesis on this name for investors.
What about the risk in particular of Facebook being broken up, given that the FTC, certainly it's not required, but the FTC has suggested that could be a remedy, spinning off Instagram, spinning off WhatsApp?
Well, one of the smoking guns, Emily, that came out of those congressional hearings this summer, and by the way, it was already brought up in a couple of really great books that have been published in the last year or two about Facebook and Instagram, particularly Sarah Fryer's book, is that there's no question that Facebook bought Instagram in part to take out what they perceived as a potential future competitor. And so those are the things that antitrust laws are sort of meant to stop or to at least address. Why that wasn't addressed the first time the FTC looked at that acquisition is a little bit of a mystery. But anyway, that's it does raise the issue that these will be forced breakups. I think the breakup of WhatsApp is a little harder to see what the rationale for that would be. It's not clearly in the same industry as Facebook. That was kind of more of an orthogonal acquisition, but the pressure is going to be there. I think it's unlikely there'll be required spinoffs, but it is possible.
Now, you just put out a note on Uber, and you are pretty bullish on how they come out of the pandemic. Why?
I'm sorry, Emily. Let's see. On Uber, this remains our top pick in the group. We have noticed this multi-year rise in the interest of ride sharing. What I found most interesting from this report and this survey was the finding that consumers are finding new use cases for ride sharing. Dara Khosrow-Shah, he talked about this on the last earnings call, that New Yorkers, he was specifically pointing to, were starting to use ride sharing during the middle of the day during non-peak commute times. Our surveys showed that people were starting to use ride sharing to run errands. If that use case continues post-COVID, and then you have your general use cases rising, for social events, for airport runs. What it means is that the use cases for ride sharing, for Uber, for Lyft, all in are going to be greater post-COVID, whenever post-COVID is. I thought that was an unusually bullish takeaway. So we continue to like Uber. It's our top pick in large cap.
Now, interesting, Uber's obviously one of the companies that has struggled in the midst of the pandemic. Yeah. Stitch Fix is another company that you're looking at that struggled early on as well, made big job cuts, but seems to be taking off like a rocket ship. What are you seeing in terms of the path ahead there?
So that's going to be a COVID recovery play. Online retail as a category, Emily, just accelerated like a rocket ship throughout COVID, except for fashion and apparel, because we didn't want to buy clothes to go out because we weren't going out. But now we're starting to think about going out. There's been a lot of pent up dollars. I think people will be looking to refresh their wardrobes. And in the meantime, I think Stitch Fix, Katrina Lake, that company, I think they've done a lot of product improvements. And, to me, that's what innovation, product improvements really drive value to for these companies over time. And I think investors kind of may have underappreciated some of the changes that they've made. The site is more personalized. They figured out new features. They've kind of gamified the service a little bit. And I think as you come out of COVID, you'll see a really nice, sharp recovery in both new users and in revenue at Stitch Fix. This has been one of our top picks in small cap. We've had a dramatic surge in the shares, so it's become a pretty small buy for us now. But fundamentally, it's a much stronger asset. It will be coming out of COVID than it was coming in. That's why investors are excited.
Now, you've been covering tech a long time, Mark, and I'm sure you followed the Airbnb and DoorDash IPOs last week, doubling their valuations. Even Brian Chesky, the CEO, seemed stunned when I told him live on air where the shares were about to open at. As we head into 2021, are you concerned about froth in the market? We're already looking at a couple of companies, Affirm and Roblox, that are postponing their IPOs till next year as they try to get a sense of what is happening in this market.
Well, yeah, this is unusual what we've seen. I don't have a formal opinion on either Airbnb and or DoorDash. I want to look at names this year which have risen a lot, but because their estimates have gone up. So I look at a good classic case like a Facebook or an Amazon. It's not so much the re-rating. We haven't seen these multiples fly to the moon. What we've seen is the numbers have gone up. Everybody's estimates on the street for Amazon have gone up materially since the beginning of the year because their revenue growth accelerated. They were big winners off of advertising and the cloud computing business. Even though all three of their engines of growth have actually benefited from COVID. So I think there's less risk in a good, solid name like that. And my guess is that you'll see kind of a recovery back, a return by investors back to kind of the standard bearers of tech, especially those that benefited, but also came up with new investment initiatives during the course of the year. Again, Amazon's the poster child here. They're increasing their distribution capacity by 50% this year. They really leaned into COVID. And I think what's going to come out of that for them is accelerated market share gains. So I think investors can still stick with that name and it'll continue to outperform for them, despite already outperforming this year.
All right. Well, great expectations for a lot of these companies. RBC Capital Markets Managing Director Mark Mahaney, also always appreciate you telling us whether they can live up. All right, coming up, Russian hackers are suspected in a global campaign in attacking some of the most critical U.S. government agencies. We will bring you everything you need to know next. This is Bloomberg. A number of U.S. government agencies were targeted in one of the most audacious attacks in recent memory. The Department of Homeland Security, as well as Treasury and Commerce, are said to be among the agencies experiencing this breach. Hackers tied to the Russian government are suspected in the campaign. For more, I want to bring in Bloomberg cybersecurity reporter Aliza Sebenius. Aliza, thank you so much for joining us. So how exactly did this work?
This is part of a highly sophisticated global campaign. What happened is hackers inserted a vulnerability into the software updates of a company called SolarWinds. SolarWinds is a Texas-based company that sells technology across the U.S. government and private sector. So, for example, the State Department, the FBI, the U.S. military, and hundreds of Fortune 500 corporations use its technologies. So when the software updates were pushed out, this meant that its customers were potentially compromised. We know that as many as 18,000 of its customers may have been exposed during this hack.
So who is, as far as we know, behind the campaign and what was their intent?
Hackers tied to the Russian government are suspected to be responsible, and one of the suspected culprits is this group called APT29, which became infamous when it hacked the DNC in 2016. It's also known for hacking COVID vaccine research this year in the U.S. As of now, it appears that this was part of an espionage campaign, according to analysts that are studying it. But of course, that they note this is really early and they're still trying to understand what was taken, what happened, and what the intent was. But if this was a cyber espionage campaign, it's going to go down as one of the broadest and most consequential in recent memory, says many of the analysts who are studying this.
Now, many expected a hack like this to happen during the U.S. presidential election. It didn't appear that happened. How does this fit into the broader story?
One of the theories floating around Washington, D.C. right now is that while the U.S. government was laser focused on ensuring that the 2020 election went on without a hack from any foreign adversaries, the attackers used it as an opportunity to get into other parts of the government and other corporations that, weren't under the same scrutiny by the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI, because so many resources at the time were focused on the election. So it is possible that they saw the election as an opportunity to focus on other targets because they knew that's where the United States was focused.
So what is the cyber threat landscape that President-elect Biden will be entering?
It's really interesting because this is coming as, of course, there is a transition of power going on in Washington, D.C. And what many of the people studying this breach say is that, this kind of thing takes some time. So it's going to take months until we fully understand who was targeted, what was breached. They expect an ever-increasing list of what is already, a wide-ranging hack. So what the Biden administration will be inheriting is, an investigation into what's happening, mitigation measures, and then they need to figure out a plan to deter the adversary responsible from conducting future hacks. One thing the U.S. government has tried is naming hackers, and we'll see if they
Eliza, we're going to have to leave it there. Eliza Sabanius, thank you so much for giving us the lay of the land and for President-elect Biden as he enters office. Coming up, Ron Conway, angel investor, joins us to talk about tech valuations, his stakes in DoorDash and Airbnb. That's next. This is Bloomberg. We've got some breaking news. California has officially cast its vote in the Electoral College, meaning that Joe Biden now officially has as many votes as he needs to take the presidency of the United States. California casting 50 electoral votes for Joe Biden. Senate Majority Whip John Thune, one of the highest-ranking GOP members, has said it is time for all to move on. We'll see if this now gets more Republicans publicly on side. Meantime, Airbnb and DoorDash pulled back a bit today after their blockbuster debuts. Both companies' shares are down about 12% since the IPO. This after DoorDash surged 86% on opening day, with Airbnb skyrocketing 113%. Here's the CEOs reacting to those price jumps.
When I was delivering hummus for my Honda, Emily, that 7 years earlier, this wasn't exactly what I was thinking about when I was in my car making those deliveries. So it certainly is surreal.
Shares indicated to open right now at $139 a share, which is more than double what you priced at.
That's the first time I've heard that number. That's I don't know what else to say. I'm very humbled by it.
All right, Airbnb CEO Brian Chesky at a loss for words there when I updated him on trade. Joining me now to talk about the path forward for both companies and early investor in both Airbnb and DoorDash, Ron Conway, founder and co-managing partner at SV Angel, a fund that has seen companies as big as Google and Facebook go from early stage IPO. So Ron, I know this is a really proud moment for you, seeing both of these companies get out the gate, rapturous on Wall Street. That said, all of the talk right now is about whether the price of both of them is just too high. I mean, what is your reaction and your take on that?
Well, I'd like to comment on what might be even more significant for our country. How apropos is it that California put Joe Biden over the edge to be the next president of this country so that we can have some civility and productivity? That's as exciting as the IPOs last week.
You are, Ron, very involved in local politics, I know. Do you think having President Biden in office will change the way business is done in Silicon Valley or has been done over the last 4 years? What will change for tech?
I think for a while, Joe Biden has really big fish to fry. He has to resolve the COVID pandemic, and he has to get the economy off the ground. I don't think Joe Biden's going to be thinking about the tech community and Silicon Valley for a while, and nor should he, given the priorities that this country needs work on.
Let's talk a little about Airbnb and DoorDash. You know, obviously they've been part of the fabric of this community. There's been controversy around their role in the community. I am curious thoughts on their public debuts and whether you think our signs were in a bubble.
Well, I actually think that DoorDash and Airbnb are mission-driven companies. They are companies that are greatly improving the life of, in the case of Airbnb, hosts who augment their income with the fees that they get from the guests. In the case of DoorDash right now, trying to keep the restaurants in this country alive, and also employing the drivers who are delivering the meals. So I actually put those two companies in the mission-driven column, which really is a proud thing for the tech community. As for the stock prices, I think Airbnb and DoorDash, they have big shoes to fill, but the markets that they serve are gigantic. You know, the travel industry is a $3.4 trillion industry, and the food delivery business is approaching a $1 trillion total available market. So these companies have a lot of headway to grow.
Now, you are still investing in a company every week, as you have been for years. And on the private side of the market, are you seeing valuations that you believe are too high?
Well, you're right. SV Angel, we invest in one new company a week for 30 years. We've been at it for a while, as you know. And valuations have crept up over the last few years. During the pandemic, valuations have kind of flattened, but they have flattened at a pretty high level. And the amazing thing is the number of founders who have the courage to start a company during the pandemic is astounding. Our deal flow rate is just the same as it's been. You know, we look at 50 to 70 companies before we invest in one company a week. So the activity level of entrepreneurs during the pandemic is pretty astounding. It has stayed steady.
Interesting. So what is your outlook on Silicon Valley emerges from the pandemic? You know, I've spoken to investors who say they're telling their portfolio companies, if they have an opportunity to raise now, take the money now, because we don't know what's to come. I mean, do you think these good times will continue, or that funding could dry up as we head into next year?
Well, I'm on the more optimistic side. Given the vaccine, and assuming that gets efficiently distributed across our country, I think innovation will thrive more than ever. If the vaccine distribution for some reason had a hiccup, then I'd be a little more worried, but I don't see that happening. I'm very optimistic.
Now, given how active you are in San Francisco politics, I'm curious what you think about, the governor's response to the COVID crisis, Mayor Breed's response to the COVID crisis. We're currently in a lockdown. You've got companies leaving the Bay Area. You've got companies and tech companies leaving San Francisco. Are you concerned about that?
Wow, that's a lot to cover. As far as of Gavin Newsom's COVID response, I think he's been very, very responsive, along with the mayors across the state. And I'm absolutely delighted that the tech community is playing a huge role in California right now in curbing the spread of COVID. Apple and Google several months ago announced a software app called Exposure Notification. And California launched their exposure notification app called California Notify just a week ago. And in the last week, over 7 million Californians have turned on that app. And that app will help save lives, because if someone ends up getting COVID, just by typing in a verification code in their phone, they will anonymously let everyone know they've been in contact with over the last 2 weeks for over 15 minutes that they've been exposed to COVID, and they should quarantine and do intense testing to see if they have COVID. So the tech community is playing a really nice role here.
Now, are you concerned seeing, HPE moving to Texas, Oracle moving to Texas, Elon Musk moving to Texas? Does that worry you as someone who's, played a huge role in building up the tech community in San Francisco?
Yes, it is alarming, but I have always thought that technology should be spread all across this country and not just on the two coasts. And I think Texas now has enough, given the two announcements last week. We need tech companies to blossom and relocate to the Midwest. There's an income inequality gap in this country that is causing the divide and polarization. And by creating more jobs in the middle of our country, I think the tech community can be a big part of the solution to the polarization in the country right now, so that we have tech companies in the middle of the country as well.
All right, Ron Conway, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us. It's been a while since we've had you on the show, and really interesting to hear what your thoughts are on all of this as we go through this unprecedented time. Ron Conway, SV Angel founder and co-managing partner. All right, coming up, as we approach a changing of the guard, questions remain about how the new administration will tackle China, especially with regard to tech. We're going to be speaking with former U.S. Trade Representative Carla Hills. Next, this is Bloomberg. All right, breaking news. President Trump has just indicated that Attorney General Bill Barr will be leaving the Department of Justice before Christmas. The president just tweeted, "Just had a very nice meeting with Attorney General Bill Barr at the White House. Our relationship has been a very good one. He has done an outstanding job. As per letter, Bill will be leaving just before Christmas to spend the holidays with his family." The president saying that Jeff Rosen will become acting attorney general during that time. Of course, we're still waiting for President-elect Biden to make his choice and officially make a nomination for attorney general. But again, Attorney General Barr will be leaving the Department of Justice before Christmas. Meantime, as the U.S. prepares for new leadership, one of the major questions will be how will China be handled? The U.S. China Economic and Security Review Commission came out with a report earlier this month highlighting the continued threat that China poses to American values and amid a continuing U.S. effort to roll back China's dominance in next-generation 5G communications, the role of tech is emerging as a clear theme throughout the annual report. Joining me now to discuss, former Housing and Urban Development Secretary Carla Hills, who served as a U.S. Trade Representative from 1989 to 1993 and currently Hills and Company Chair and CEO. Carla, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have your perspective on the show. I mean, what are you expecting President-elect Biden's tact and strategy will be on China?
First of all, I think that his tone with China, and indeed with all governments, will change, and it will be far, far more diplomatic. And then secondly, I think he will search for areas where he could and his team could work with China, like climate, world health, nuclearization or denuclearization. So I think it will be a more calm circumstance. In other words, a dose of diplomacy. I also think he will work with his.
Do you think he'll reopen?
I think he will.
More specifically, will he reopen the Phase 1 deal? Will he push for a Phase 2 kind of deal?
I don't think that the reopening of the Phase 1 deal will be the first thing he does. I do think that he will try to remove some of the tariffs, particularly on our allies, but on China, that are hurting our own workers, farmers, and manufacturers. And I think that he will deal with our allies in trying to talk to China through the issues that are creating the friction. You know, when China agreed to join the World Trade Organization in 2001, it knew it was a market open rule setup. And under Deng Xiaoping, it moved in that direction. And I think the quarrel is not that China is communist, but it is not adhering to the rules. And that is something that I think Biden will address. And his new USTR, who is familiar with both trade and Chinese, speaks Mandarin, will, I think, focus on these issues.
There are folks who believe that the president's tougher stance on China was long overdue. And I wonder, do you think there's anything about President Trump's trade war with China that was effective?
Well, I don't think you need to take a tougher approach. I think you have to take a more strategic approach where you're facing differences. My own view is if in 2016 we had joined hands with our allies and had gone to China and with courtesy said, look, you cannot give subsidies to state-owned enterprises. You cannot fail to notify when you give a subsidy. You cannot not give protection to intellectual property, and your percentage caps on our inward investment are discriminatory. And you have committed to give us, all of us, national treatment and non-discrimination. And if you don't want to play by those rules, we would ask you to step out of the World Trade Organization. And I think China, confronted by more than 60% of global GDP, would have been quite serious in addressing this issue. As it was, we did it unilaterally. I think it was a huge, huge mistake.
What is your opinion on the TikTok saga, which, TikTok sort of became a flashpoint for U.S. China relations? Do things just return to normal for TikTok under a Biden administration?
Well, you already have 2 court decisions that say that the prior administration, the Trump administration, had not made their case. And I'm not a technology expert, but I would say that the apps that 100 million Americans use is really strange to call it a national security issue. But in any event, I think we could have handled that issue differently.
All right. Well, certainly a lot remains to be seen in terms of how President-elect Biden approaches the relationship with China, perhaps more strategically, as you indicate. Carla Hills, former U.S. Trade Representative and Hills & Company Chair and CEO, thank you so much. Really fascinating to have your perspective. Okay, still ahead, the self-driving startup Zoox is reimagining ride-hailing, unveiling its fully autonomous robo-taxi. Bloomberg will bring you an exclusive conversation with the CEO of Zoox next. This is Bloomberg. Zoox, the self-driving startup owned by Amazon, has unveiled a fully functioning production robotaxi. The company plans to deploy fleets of the self-driving carriage in their own autonomous ride-hailing service. Zoox's CEO spoke with our own Ed Ludlow about the business model in an exclusive interview. Take a listen.
We will own the fleet, and you, the customer, will only pay for a ride. And what's great from an efficiency standpoint, with cars today, with personal cars, really they are used 4% of the time, and 96% of the time they are depreciating and using space, parking in cities. So in this case, you pay for the ride, and when your ride, before your ride is even over, we'll know the next customer to pick up. So she'll constantly be running and really be still, only to go charge and then get back on the road.
Have you thought about how you'll charge customers? Will it be a sort of flat fare per trip? Will it be done by mile? Will it be equivalent to the ride-hailing services that are out there today?
We've thought about it a lot. We don't want to disclose any details because things may change, as you know. Who would have thought what's going on right now with the pandemic? What we'll tell you is that it will be affordable. We want this to be very accessible to folks, and there will be several ways and several plans to enjoy the service.
The other big piece of news this year was that Zoox was acquired by Amazon.
Yes.
What does that mean for Zoox, having Amazon as a parent company, essentially?
First of all, it's a great company. It's a great partner. It's an honor to be chosen by them. That means that not only do we have the capital required, we have the long-term vision, the ability to focus and execute. And this is really about reimagining transportation, really. And so it gives us a baseline to build from and then expand on.
Reimagining transportation, does that mean that you could work with Amazon down the line in terms of making their delivery fleets autonomous, for example, something like that, non-passenger type services?
Potentially, as you see with this vehicle and how modular it is, first we're going to move people around. That's where the demand is. That's the greatest benefit for society, the cities, and everybody involved, meaning the customers too. But yes, I will admit that if we can move people, especially with this footprint, at some point we could move packages, yes.
How long is it going to take for me to be able to actually experience this in the real world? When do you think you'll deploy a commercial service here in the United States?
So we're not making any announcements on timing, but I know this is a very favorite question. So what we're focused on is testing on private roads and on public roads, making sure that the service is safe and delivers to its promise. So I'll make you a deal. It's not as long as is speculated in some press or in some circles, but it's not next year either.
Which kinds of environments do you think that you'll launch the service in first?
So dense urban environment is our footprint, but we've been public about the fact that Las Vegas and San Francisco are two initial targets. And obviously this is also why you see our L3 testing fleet in those cities currently.
What do you see on the business side, the path being for Zoox? Will it remain a part of Amazon? Do you think that you one day could be spun off and go public? You know, it's an interesting question because it's a nascent technology and not yet deployed, but in 10 years' time, we could see Zoox operating services in cities all across the world.
At this point in time, we're proud to be part of Amazon, a global company. Never say never about what the future holds, but the privilege we have right now is to focus on solving this and delivering it to customers, and that's really where we're.
What's the biggest bar to deployment right now? What's the biggest challenge that you're having to overcome now that you've designed and started to build this vehicle?
I would say completing the technology with an eye on safety. Safety is one of our most important parameters. And I've been public in saying that until I'm willing to put my 15-year-old and my 13-year-old in the vehicle by themselves to go to, I don't know, piano lesson or guitar lesson. And so achieving that is really where we're focused on, and doing it in a quantifiable way.
That was Zoox CEO Aisha Evans there with Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow. And that does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. Bloomberg Tape Break Asia is next. This is Bloomberg.